So here we come toward the very end of our P90 series. We're going to be talking just a little bit on Palm Sunday, but we're pretty much wrapping up our series, and I think it's going to be a fitting day in many ways for us to do that. I'm sure this is a big Hunger Games weekend. How many of you are familiar with the Hunger Games? You either saw the movie or you read the book. A lot of hands, right? I'm sure the popularity of it is in large part because the books are enjoyable and fairly well written and all that kind of stuff. The movie is going to be, it is already, but it's going to be just a runaway hit and all that kind of stuff. It's fascinating to me because the ideas behind it are very much related to some of these deeper instinctual kinds of fears and needs that humanity has. I think it's also interesting, of course, because in this book and now movie, there's a little bit of an echo of some of the tensions we're feeling in our own country, and a little bit of the class warfare conversation stuff going on, when all of the resources that are in this world are not well distributed. And how often have we seen throughout history that the collection of all of the world's resources, or so many of the world's resources, in the hands of a few can lead to such catastrophic and devastating kinds of things. And I think in its own clever way, the Hunger Games is sort of teasing that out for us a little bit, helping us to see. And, we read about some of these lives and it just seems, it's an enjoyable thing, but we can miss some of those underlying kinds of truths. Those underlying truths that are some really hard truths about the world, but also hard truths about our very own communities. If you were to really think about our own neighborhoods, we know that we are in the midst of incredible affluence. We live in the midst of more affluence than most of the world has ever known throughout history. We have more and have more at our disposal than anyone in previous generations could have imagined, besides the royalty and those at the very highest percentages of society. But for most people around the world, for all of history, it just hasn't been so. And there are really two hard truths that I wanted to introduce us to in helping us sort of understand both our project today and a very practical way that we can start to put some real effort and pragmatic energy into our P90 series. The two hard truths, the first of these truths, is that hunger is rampant in our community. In our communities, hunger is rampant. Now, we would hear that and think, really? Really? Our biggest challenges are $4 a gallon gas. Come on. It's just, when you can whine about, it costs us $100 to put gas in our tanks, and we whine about it because, it's up so much. And I remember when it was 95 cents and blah, 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 blah. We have this idea like, oh, come on. How can you really complain when we're paying $4 for a cup of coffee and we have $150 cable subscriptions coming into the house? It doesn't make any sense that we could really talk about hunger. And yet, the statistics, widespread studies throughout Long Island will tell us that 285,000 people are challenged with food needs throughout our island in a given month. 285,000. 110,000 of them are children. 110,000. So if you were to draw a circle with our two campuses as the end points of this circle, and you were just to draw a big old circle, you would have to imagine everyone inside that circle as a child and hungry, and you still don't get the amount of people that are actually hungry on Long Island. It isn't enough. Imagine every single person you see in your drive home being a hungry child. Every single person you see passing in the car, standing at the bus stops, every single person being a hungry child, and you're starting to get an idea as to the depth of the need. We're talking about 10% of the people on Long Island that have some sort of a challenge. They say 65,000 people will use a food pantry every day. 65,000 people. These numbers are staggering. And this is in our communities, our wealthy communities, the communities where we're still talking about buying $4 cups of coffee. See, this is a perspective that I think we often forget. It is an ugly truth. If in a neighborhood like this there can still be such hunger, you can only begin to imagine what it's like when you get into the communities where it's not a few percent, it's not 10%, but it might be 30 or 40 or 50%. They say that half of the people who are challenged in this way throughout a given week will have to make a decision this month between food and rent, or food and heat. How many of us have to make these kinds of decisions? I mean, these are things that are so foreign to our experience. Cheryl and I, we spent this last Wednesday afternoon at the racetrack. We figured all the talk about money, we were going to try to make a little extra. I'm just kidding, because those of you who already know that there are no races at the racetrack, you already know that they haven't actually opened up. So we were obviously not there for that part of the racetrack. We went there because a friend that we had recently met was a chaplain for the racetrack, which, I don't even understand what that meant. I didn't understand. I was like, really? Like, for the horses? For the gamblers? Like, what are you really doing there? Like, you're praying for the horses, or you're trying to get people to stop gambling? I don't even know what a chaplain at the racetrack would do. Well, apparently there's this whole subculture here that we're just mostly unaware of. There's 1,500 people that are regularly at the racetrack to care for the horses and the grounds. Most of them live there year-round. Many of them are sort of migratory. They go with the horses, between here and Saratoga and other places. But 1,500 people. And what he would describe as their reality, it's incredible. Often they have the clothes on their back. They can't find a bed to sleep in. They can't afford the food that they're being offered on the ground, so they've got to set up these little micro economies to try to find ways to get food. He's got a food pantry that he's using. 1,500 right there in Elmont who are constantly under the pressure of not having enough to eat. Not having enough to eat. This is the reality of our communities as you begin to peel back the layers. That's the first hard truth. The second hard truth is that selfishness and greed are rampant in our communities. I began to tell you a little bit about this study that came out from UC Berkeley about greed and about what it does to people. Or actually, I should say it the other way, what wealth does to people. And it's fascinating. It's a startling sort of a study to me. Here's a couple of more of the details. They first did the study by checking out who was driving expensive cars. And we've all sort of anecdotally known this. Those who drive the really expensive cars do not yield to anyone. Right? They're at a four-way stop, and this is what they did. At four-way stops, those with the more expensive cars yielded 4 times less than the people with the less expensive cars. That number went up if it was car versus pedestrian. Because, of course, that makes perfect sense. So this got them thinking. They designed a whole series of studies. One of them, they let people have some candy from a candy jar, and they told them that the next stop for that candy jar was another study going on in another room for children. So that it was literally candy for children. And they found that those with a higher socioeconomic status would take more candy, leaving less for the children in the next study. They had a whole series of these. One of them they tried to measure who would more often cheat. Those with a higher socioeconomic standard would cheat more readily on tests, at quizzes and things that gave them a shot at getting more money. They had a little study that they did as well that would allow a person to evaluating a person's responses when they thought about wealth. All right, so think about it. So here's what they did. It isn't just those who are wealthy. They wanted to find out what would happen if you thought about being wealthy, right? And they discovered that if you think about being wealthy and then take these tests, that you will do the same as if you were wealthy. So you become greedy and more self-centered and less other-focused as you think about being wealthy. That one's pretty startling to me. You don't even have to be wealthy. You just have to want it. And suddenly you start becoming more and more self-centered, more and more selfish. The study was done by a group of different folks, and there's a whole degree of them that are out there. But if you for practical purposes, you have to realize that, if you are working somewhere and you give somebody, the wrong change, the people who with less resources are more likely to give it back to you. The people with more resources, they're not so likely. If you're crossing the street, you need to remember to look for the car that you're trying to cross in front of. You need to know who you're cutting off and who's not going to cut, who's willing to yield and who isn't. The idea here, of course, was always that it's the people who are financially challenged who will act more unethically because they're the ones in the greatest need. And they're saying, no, it's actually quite the opposite. Those with the greatest need will be more likely to return to you a mistake in the change you give them. They'll be more likely to return it even though their need for it is greater. So there's all sorts of reasons. They're philosophizing and trying to figure out why it is that we act this way. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 1. Philippians chapter 2, verse 1. We looked at this passage in a different context. But let's read it here. You can follow along in the Bibles that are scattered throughout the room. Paul tells the Philippians, "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." I love how he ties in this idea of tenderness and compassion. If you have any tenderness and compassion. Now, he knew the Philippians. They were good folk. They were sacrificial. And he's just reminding them again, if you have any tenderness, if you have any compassion, if that is rooted in any way from what God has already done for you, for the love that Christ has poured out on you, then there ought to be some tenderness and there ought to be some compassion. And that can fuel your ability to look out into this world and to see real need and to meet that need. It can cause your heart to be stirred up in such a way that you begin to not simply look out for your own interests, but you can really genuinely, wholeheartedly look out to the interest of others. You can be other-centered, other-focused. I think when Paul is talking about this, soon he's going to talk about Jesus and his great humility. He's rooting these things. He's tying them all up into a response that we have for the great things that God has done, for the obvious humility that Christ showed us, and saying how much more so now that we've experienced it, that we've been the recipient of this kind of goodness, of this kind of grace, of this kind of tenderness and compassion. How much more so now can we show this kind of sacrificial tenderness and compassion? Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking out for your own interests, but also to the interests of others. So there are two exercises that are designed to confront these two truths that we looked at. The first exercise is simply to give food to the hungry. Now, immediately, a lot of you are no doubt thinking to yourself, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. And if you, teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And then he can start a fishing company and he can sell overpriced fish to other hungry people. And there's all sorts of great ideas that can go with this. I'm not denying that it's a great idea to teach a man to fish. I'm just saying that if you give food to hungry people, you have met an immediate need. Try to teach a man to fish when he's hungry. Try to teach someone to do something good for their lives when they are having to decide between heat and food. So try to teach someone to have confidence in themselves and to work hard with their hands when they're trying to figure out how their kids can get double meals in the lunch program at school. I mean, it's not quite so easy. Most of us have never experienced anything like it. If we simply give people food, it is a good thing. It is a good thing. And I'm not saying, hey, if you've got that motivation, you've got desires, and you want to teach a man to fish, I think that is spectacular. And I think any one of you who has any sort of ideas or inclination toward that end, you should fuel those things. And you should get out there and you should figure out all sorts of great ways. Let's not use it, though, as an excuse to stop meeting needs. Okay, that's my fear. Sometimes I feel like we say, we got to teach a person to fish. And that's true, we do. But does that mean we stop actually showing compassion and tenderness to those who are in need? Oh, but there's so many reasons, there's so many reasons, there's so many reasons. One of the most brilliant things that Jesus did was not let something die the death of 1,000 qualifications. He'll just get it out there, and he'll just say it, and he'll just explain it. He doesn't say, well, you got to make sure this person, that person, that person. You got to make sure that, they're not addicts, and they're not going to sell your canned goods to buy drugs. And okay. We can kill these things before we actually ever let them thrive. And there are few things in life that are so direct, have such direct correspondence than giving food to hungry people. We have all of these things we do, and we hope for certain results. You're running a business, and you do your marketing, and you run your campaigns, and you hope that sales will go up, but you never even necessarily know why one thing works and another thing. And life is so much like this. We throw everything we have at something in so many different ways, and we hope that there's some good result, and there often is, and that's great. But what about it? What a direct causation. There's a hungry person, you give them food, guess what? They're not hungry for that time, for that moment, for those days, they're not. And that's a good and a tender and a compassionate thing. The second exercise to confront this is to actually encourage people toward generosity and away from greed. To encourage people toward generosity and away from greed. We look at that study that says that if you even think about having been wealthy or being wealthy or hoping to be wealthy, that it tends toward creating greed. Wouldn't it make sense that the reverse is true as well? Wouldn't it make sense that if you encourage people toward sacrifice and toward generosity, that it can actually begin to take away the power of greed and selfishness? You've heard this, that if even the act of smiling will make you feel better, even if you don't necessarily feel better, like if you don't want to smile. You've heard this, right? Just go ahead and smile. You feel better. And I feel better because you're smiling. See, it's like, it's good for me, good for you. But you see, they say, even if you're not actually feeling it, somehow the act produces the result. It's a curious thing. We're not even really sure how most of this happens or why it works. Something tied in with the way the brain and the hands and the actions are all tied in and woven together in this thing called humanity. It's very cool. It's very clever. God's design. If we actually do the work of generosity, it can break the power of greed. At least nibble away at it a little bit. So part of life for each of us is to do that for ourselves, but to encourage it in others. We live in an environment, we live in a society that gives so little thought to the needs of others because we feel like it's so difficult just to make it on our own, just for me and mine. Got to survive. But imagine a group of people going out into their communities and into their spheres of influence, and imagine that group of people trying to draw generosity out of the people around them. You know what you've done? You have rippling effect. You're creating opportunities for generosity, and you're defeating greed where it is rising up around us. You're defeating selfishness, and you're turning it, helping others turn it into selflessness. We see another great motivator toward this end in Matthew chapter 25. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. That's just, to me, this is amazing. It's an amazing story because, the idea of being able to give a cup of water to Jesus, it doesn't even, how? First off, he's God. Second, he's not really like here in a way that I could give him a cup of water. And Jesus is like, no, you can. You can. whatever you do for the least of these, you've done for me. So now you get a little bit more excited because now you realize you can actually do this in a very real way. Jesus wanted us to think about it in this way for some crazy motivating reason to say, this is actually work that I'm doing for my Savior. I'm giving this, it's as if I'm giving it to Him. It's as if I'm collecting food. It's like as if I'm giving Him, when He was hungry, I was giving Him something to eat. But now imagine you start to get a little bit more ambitious and you say, wait, what if I can find a way to pass out cups for lots of people to give Him water? And isn't that even a more brilliant way of bringing more hope, more needs met, more opportunities to hear this? Whatever you did for the least of these. Well, not only do I want to do that, I want to help all of you do that as well. I want you to be able to take those resources and be able to use what tools you have to help others do the exact same thing for the King. So we've got two application points. You see a theme here, right? P90S2, two great truths. True. I don't want you to miss that because it was worked hard on that. And so I thought it was very, very clever. So there are two things that we're going to ask of you this morning. The first is we're going to ask you to personally fill 2 grocery bags. Personally. Fill 2 grocery bags and bring them back to our drive over our Holy Week services. Now, here I go dying a death of 1,000 qualifications. If some of you are in genuine need and you are struggling in the way of actually needing food, then talk to us about that. Okay, please don't in any way feel obligated. The vast majority, I know that that's very, very, very few who are here today. The vast majority of us can easily fill 2 grocery bags and bring them back. And if all of us did that, we might get hundreds and hundreds of bags of groceries just from our congregation. Hundreds and hundreds of bags of groceries, which will go to local food pantries in need, which will actually go directly toward some of the 285,000 people who are currently hungry in our communities. So 2, that's the first thing I'm going to ask you. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do, the second thing I'm going to ask you to do, is to hand out 50 bags. Now we're taking all of the cups that we can get our hands on, and we're distributing them to everyone else and encouraging them to fill their cup and to bring a cup of water to our King. And if we really do get a great deal of our neighbors who are going to take these bags, fill them up, bring them back for our food drive, who knows? We could get 1,000 bags of groceries from our congregation's efforts, from your hard work, from your dedication, from your sacrifice. We could see our efforts multiplied tenfold if our community actually participates in it. We're going to explain to you in a moment how we're going to go about this project here in the morning, and we're going to encourage you guys not only to do it, but to while you're doing it, to be praying that God would stir up the hearts of the people that will be receiving it. I'm going to say a prayer, and then I'm going to have my wife, come up and tell us about the mechanics of this. Lord, we're asking that you would cause our hearts to be tender, that we would have compassion, that we would see the needs of others, and in humility, we would sacrificially meet them. This, we know, Lord, is even a small effort to do some good. May it be used by you in a big way to change us, to stir up our hearts, to touch the lives of people all around us in very real and pragmatic ways, those who will eat, who may not have, and Lord, those of us who tend toward greed and selfishness, that a little bit of that would be deconstructed and a little bit more of our tenderness and compassion would be put into its place. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.